While America was consumed by political theater and culture war battles, something extraordinary happened inside the Supreme Court that almost nobody noticed. 9 justices, conservative and liberal, appointed by Republicans and Democrats, spanning decades of ideological disagreement, unanimously agreed on a decision that fundamentally changes how police can use force against American citizens. Not 8-1, not 7-2, 9-0. When was the last time you saw that kind of consensus on anything meaningful? This wasn't some technical procedural question or narrow legal interpretation. This was a direct confrontation with how courts have been evaluating police shootings for decades, and the Supreme Court just declared that the old way was wrong, completely wrong, and they did it with a ruling so unanimous that it sent an unmistakable message. Constitutional rights require context, not convenience. The case is Barnes versus Felix, and if you carry a firearm, own one, or simply care about the limits of government power, this decision changes the rules of engagement between citizens and law enforcement in ways that will affect millions of interactions for years to come. Here's what makes this ruling genuinely revolutionary. It doesn't explicitly mention the Second Amendment, but it creates new legal protection for gun owners in situations where police encounters escalate to violence. It forces courts to examine the full context of an incident rather than just the final split second when force was used. And it gives citizens wrongfully harmed by police a fighting chance in court that they didn't have before. Let's break down what actually happened, why it matters more than headlines suggest, and what every responsible gun owner needs to understand about how this ruling protects rights you might not have known were under threat. The story begins with a traffic stop that turned fatal in approximately 5 seconds. Officer Robert Felix Jr. pulled over Ashton Barnes for suspected toll violations. Standard stop. Routine request for Barnes to exit the vehicle. Barnes opened the door and initially appeared to comply, but then suddenly attempted to drive away. Officer Felix, reacting instinctively, jumped onto the vehicle's door ledge and within 2 seconds fired 2 shots into the car. Barnes was hit and died from his wounds.
Don't fucking move! Don't fucking move! Shots fired!
The entire sequence from vehicle movement to fatal shots lasted roughly 5 seconds. The kind of rapidly evolving situation where split-second decisions happen and lives change permanently. In the aftermath, Barnes's mother sued Officer Felix, arguing that her son's Fourth Amendment rights had been violated through excessive force. The central question wasn't whether tragic events occurred, everyone agreed they did. The question was whether Officer Felix acted lawfully in that instant of perceived threat, and more fundamentally, what legal standards should courts use to evaluate that kind of situation? Should courts only look at the final seconds when the gun was fired, or should they examine the entire encounter from beginning to end? That question has divided courts for decades, and the Supreme Court just settled it definitively. Lower courts, particularly the Fifth Circuit, had long applied something called the moment of threat rule. The logic seems straightforward. Evaluate the officer's actions at the exact moment force was used. If the officer faced a genuine threat at that specific instant, the use of force was justified. End of inquiry. Don't look at what led to that moment. Don't examine whether earlier decisions by the officer created or escalated the danger. Just freeze frame the second before the trigger was pulled and ask whether a reasonable officer would have felt threatened. Under this narrow standard, both the District Court and Fifth Circuit sided with Officer Felix. The reasoning was simple. During the 2 seconds when he clung to the moving car, he faced danger that justified deadly force. Case closed, but this narrow focus created a massive problem that courts either ignored or couldn't see. Context was systematically excluded from consideration. What led to the officer physically attaching himself to the vehicle? Could the situation have been de-escalated earlier? Were Barnes's earlier actions actually dangerous? Or were they misunderstood or misinterpreted? Those questions were legally irrelevant under the moment of threat approach, and that's what the Supreme Court found constitutionally unacceptable. In a unanimous opinion written by Justice Elena Kagan, a liberal justice writing an opinion that all conservative justices joined without dissent, the court rejected the moment of threat doctrine entirely. Instead, the justices ruled that excessive force cases under the Fourth Amendment must be evaluated based on the totality of circumstances. That phrase might sound like legal jargon, but it represents a fundamental shift in how these cases get litigated. The court explicitly stated that the totality of circumstances inquiry has no time limit, meaning the entire interaction is relevant, from the initial contact through the final moments. Officer decisions leading up to the use of force now matter legally. Courts must weigh whether the force used was objectively reasonable from the perspective of a reasonable officer at the scene, considering all available information, not just the final freeze-frame moment. The opinion emphasized that earlier facts may show why an officer would view ambiguous conduct as threatening or as harmless. In plain English, you can't understand whether force was justified without understanding what led to that moment. Context isn't optional, it's constitutionally required. This sets a new precedent affecting every excessive force case nationwide, fundamentally changing how these situations get evaluated in courtrooms. Now here's why gun owners specifically should care about a case that doesn't explicitly mention firearms. More law-abiding gun owners are finding themselves in tense encounters with law enforcement precisely because they're exercising Second Amendment rights. You're carrying concealed, you get pulled over for a traffic violation, and you inform the officer you're legally armed as required by state law. That information immediately changes the dynamic of the encounter. Or maybe it's a home visit based on a red flag complaint, mistaken identity, or welfare check. In these situations, use of force can escalate terrifyingly quickly. Until this ruling, courts mostly ignored what led up to that force, focusing only on the final second when the officer felt threatened. But what if the officer's own actions created or escalated that threat? What if a lawful gun owner's completely legal behavior was misinterpreted as dangerous, and that misinterpretation led to violence? Under the old standard, courts wouldn't examine those questions. Under the new standard established by Barnes versus Felix, they must. This ruling allows courts to look at the full context, including whether the officer misunderstood a legal action as threatening, whether earlier de-escalation was possible, and whether the officer's own decisions contributed to the dangerous situation. For gun owners, that could be the difference between being wrongfully blamed for a fatal misunderstanding or having courts recognize that your constitutional rights were violated. The Supreme Court didn't just reject a narrow doctrine, they created a clearer, more balanced framework for evaluating police use of force going forward. The totality of circumstances standard isn't vague legal philosophy. It's a concrete requirement that changes how evidence gets presented and evaluated. Courts must now examine the full timeline of events, not just final moments. Officers can no longer claim justification based solely on perceived threat if that threat was shaped by earlier decisions they made. Prior interactions, behavior patterns, verbal cues, de-escalation attempts, and escalation decisions all become legally relevant evidence. This changes everything about how self-defense cases, wrongful shootings, and lawful gun owner encounters will be litigated. It's a standard rooted in fairness rather than convenience for law enforcement, and it restores constitutional depth to how the Fourth Amendment protects citizens in modern law enforcement encounters. This wasn't just a correction for the Fifth Circuit, it was a direct challenge to how multiple federal circuits have handled excessive force cases for decades. Some circuits had adopted versions of the moment of threat rule. Others applied broader standards inconsistently. With this unanimous Supreme Court ruling, all courts are on notice that the old way is unconstitutional. Here's what happens next. Lower courts must reevaluate pending excessive force cases using the new standard. Appeals from previous rulings under narrow standards may be revived and reheard, and future cases will lean heavily on Barnes versus Felix as binding precedent. In practical terms, this case is reshaping federal jurisprudence across all 50 states simultaneously. Lawyers representing victims of police overreach now have a Supreme Court-approved argument. Context is constitutionally required. That gives new legal life to cases once deemed unwinnable under the moment of threat standard. If you're a gun owner, here's your reality check. You are statistically more likely to encounter law enforcement than many other citizens. Traffic stops, range compliance checks, hunting license verification, or simply being reported by a concerned neighbor who saw you carrying. The stakes in these encounters are high. What happens in those first few seconds can be life-altering. This ruling empowers citizens to challenge wrongful conduct without being silenced by narrow legal doctrines that previously made accountability nearly impossible. It empowers attorneys to argue your rights in broader, fact-based ways that courts previously wouldn't consider. And it requires judges to demand more accountability from officers who unnecessarily escalate situations. This doesn't make all use of force illegal or second-guess every split-second decision, but it raises the legal standard for justifying force by requiring examination of the full context. Gun owners, especially those carrying concealed or exercising open carry rights, must understand that the totality of their conduct matters. But critically, so does the officer's behavior leading up to any incident. That legal symmetry was long overdue and represents genuine progress toward equal accountability. For years, constitutional debates treated the Second and Fourth Amendments as separate spheres, one about gun rights, the other about searches and seizures. But Barnes versus Felix blurs that divide in a way that strengthens both. Here's the connection. The Second Amendment protects your right to keep and bear arms, but the Fourth Amendment protects your right to not be wrongfully searched, seized, or harmed because you're exercising that right. Your right to bear arms is only truly secure if courts also recognize that you shouldn't be punished, injured, or killed simply for exercising it lawfully. This ruling establishes that lawful gun ownership cannot serve as automatic justification for lethal force unless the full context warrants it. That's a constitutional shield every gun owner should understand. It marks a historic convergence where your right to carry and your right to be free from unreasonable seizure, which includes being shot, work together rather than existing in isolated legal silos. The implications ripple outward in ways we're only beginning to understand. Police training will need to adapt. Officers must now account for how their actions before a shooting may be judged in court under totality of circumstances analysis. Gun rights advocates have a new legal tool for defending citizens wrongfully targeted in gray area encounters where legal carry was misinterpreted as threat. States and municipalities may face new lawsuits, policy revisions, and pressure to align law enforcement practices with this broader constitutional interpretation. And the court's 9-0 unanimity sends an unmistakable message. This isn't political gamesmanship or ideological warfare. This is constitutional law being restored to its proper meaning. It may represent the beginning of a new era in how police powers get restrained, rights get enforced, and citizens get respected under the law. Whether you're a gun owner, a rights advocate, or someone who simply wants a fair justice system, Barnes v. Felix changes the landscape fundamentally. It reaffirms that your rights don't stop when you're pulled over, questioned, or confronted. Constitutional rights require context, not convenience, and courts can no longer take shortcuts that systematically favor law enforcement at the expense of citizen protections. This ruling gives hope that courts will truly examine all facts in controversial shootings rather than accepting officer narratives uncritically. It provides precedent that protects you if you're misunderstood during a tense moment while carrying legally. The rules just changed, and they changed in favor of constitutional accountability. That's worth understanding, celebrating, and using when circumstances demand it.